Hey everyone, I'm Walter. I'm a data science lead at Gauntlet. We're super excited and honored to be hosting today's Restaking Day. Super exciting space. We hope to really facilitate a lot of brilliant discussion on restaking, what it's going to look like in the next few months, how it's going to evolve in the next year or so. Hopefully there's a lot of alpha today. Hopefully everyone's excited. But yeah, since its inception, the restaking space has grown quite tremendously. There's a lot of new services active on EigenLayer right now. A lot of new retake assets available. New marketplaces are coming up as well. It makes sense then to open today's discussion on, some of the patterns that have moved between whether it's EigenLayer or Symbiotic or others. If there are multiple marketplaces, it follows in that people can move stake or like flow stake various marketplaces. We'll do some exploration today on some of the patterns that are emerged here and what it looks like. Yeah, we'll first give a brief refresher on some of the what restaking actually is, like a one sentence summary on this, what the current status of restaking is, marketplaces that have risen up, as well as some of their growths since inception. We'll then go into what some of the flows look like between these marketplaces, how stake has moved between the marketplaces, what patterns exist here, and then finally close out with some of the downstream implications on the services that are secured by these marketplaces. So yeah, as a one sentence summary of what restaking basically is, it basically takes your stake ETH to secure the L1 or other POS services and uses it to economically secure secondary services. And over the past few months, the restaking landscape has grown quite tremendously. I mean, in the past half year alone itself, EigenLayer has reached $15 billion in TVL. Symbiotic has reached almost $1 billion in TVL. These two marketplaces are, while they're generally fairly similar, there are some nuances in idiosyncrasy, and their architecture is slightly different in general. For EigenLayer, they focus on, they allow different flavors of it. So naturally, it facilitates individual L1 stakers or validators to also use their stake to secure ABSs by spinning up eigenpods. Exact infrastructural details are not really in the scope here. On the other hand, Symbiotic focuses more on basically facilitating any sort of ERC20 to be used as collateral for restake. Um, while now they're more focused on using LSTs in general. They do help. Uh, they do allow SUSD, E, and Athena to be, I guess, pre-staked, but not really restaked in this case, but just staked to secure Athena's own personal use cases. The two marketplaces also differ slightly in how they handle tokenized claims to stakes, or in other words, LRTs. For EigenLayer, a lot of the LRTs function fairly independently from one another, right? Like Renzo, EtherFi, Puffer, they all have their own architecture. They all differ quite dramatically in some senses from each other based on what you see on Twitter and stuff. On the other hand, Symbi curates like a hub for LRTs to congregate. This hub is Mellow. Mellow provides sort of common infrastructure to allow anyone to spin up their own LRTs. But yeah, given the permissionless nature of these marketplaces, it means that stakers can move stake and security from one to the other. Perhaps they're taking advantages and differences in staking architecture. Perhaps Symbiotic has launched a new ERC20 as collateral, and EigenLayer restakers wanting to sort of rebalance their staking portfolio want to move funds from EigenLayer to Symbiotic. Basically here, going from right to left. On the other hand, perhaps, there's a new ABS that's launching on EigenLayer that's, expected to have pretty natural, like pretty high yielding, a lot of organic use cases. And some depositor Symbiotic might be incentivized to move over to those yields. But it's this dynamism in this stake, how it moves around and how it flows around, that really adds a new dimension to how we might think about economic security um, for the various services as well. Since the security of these secondary services is highly dependent on this underlying stake in Symbiotic and EigenLayer, it naturally follows that any sort of movement between EigenLayer and Symbiotic, these funds will also necessarily impact the security of these services on top. So changes in this underlying stake, or like in other words, the flows, will necessarily change the security profile for these AVSs. Which means that in these initial stages, even though it might be considered that, there's $15 billion in TVL and EigenLayer, this might be considered like a security surplus in a sense. It's probably important right now to be able to quantify the flows between these various marketplaces in a couple of dimensions. Number one, if we could consider like a sort of time dimension to these flows, basically saying, oh, if we can understand, how much stake is flowing from Symbiotic EigenLayer, say like right now to an hour from now or a day from now, can we use this to predict something in the future? Number two, the types of assets being moved over. Is it just like STETH? Is it RETH? Is it basically any sort of LST or like non-LSTs? What does that look like? And number three, how are they being deposited? How are they being moved over? For Symbiotic, I mentioned earlier the idea of Mellow. Mellow serves as sort of that preliminary deposit source. Are funds mostly moving from EigenLayer to Symbiotic directly, or are they going through Mellow first? So understanding all these things, being able to quantify this stuff, will help create a contour on how we think about this stake dynamism. And it will help better inform us on how we can maintain robust economic security for these AVSs moving forward. Yeah, what have we seen so far with some of these flows? What do some of these relationships look like? Yeah, we can first explore a little bit about how Mellow and Symbiotic have grown over the past month, actually. It's only been 1 month. Wow. Okay, yeah. Yeah, June 10-ish, June 11, I don't know the exact date, but Symbiotic Mellow launched. Since then, Mellow has grown, and we're only going to limit it to ETH-based assets for now. We're going to temporarily ignore Athena and SUSDE since we're only focused. But since then, it's grown to about 180K deposited in Mellow and 250K deposited in Symbiotic. The blue line here represents the Symbiotic stuff, and the green line represents the Mellow stuff. You can see pretty quickly that the blue line, the Symbiotic stuff, is pretty capped by its, its stringent limitations on its supply caps, right? I think in the beginning, Symbiotic had like 40K cap for wrap stake ETH, and then as a particular data point, on July 3, it raised caps. The cap for wrap stake ETH went from 40K to like 200K, and this was hit in like 3 to 5 hours or some like very marginal time frame like that. You also notice that like a lot of the growth for Symbiotic sort of, tapers off as well. This is due to the fact that some of the smaller LSTs, they're probably slower to hit their caps, so their funds probably move in a little slower as well. But the interesting idea here is that like if you look at the Mellow line, the green line, you'll notice that it's constantly accruing stake in the interim. Even while the Symbiotic deposits are limited, Mellow sort of serves as that, preliminary deposit source, that intermediary source. And on June 27, when Mellow raised caps for some of its LRT vaults, you can actually sort of see like an acceleration in growth as well. So this is something to keep in mind as we continue to explore like how these flows have developed over time. If we compare with EigenLayer since the start of June as well, we'll notice something like slightly different, right? Here, the red line represents the change in TVL for LRTs. We're proxying by Renzo and EtherFi in this particular instance. And the purple line at the bottom shows the LST withdrawals that are directly deposited into EigenLayer. So you can see that like for the LSTs, like the attrition rate, the withdrawal rate sort of tapers off towards the end of June. Roughly like 60K-ish LSTs are withdrawn. On the other hand, a lot of the LRTs are withdrawn post June 18, which is when like Renzo formally released their withdrawals mechanism. As you can see, it's quite a pretty dramatic drop. Probably like 300K ETH worth was like withdrawn via out of Renzo. If you put the two together, you can sort of see like a transition in a sense, right? In the beginning, in the beginning parts of June to mid-June, symbiotic and EigenLayer sort of grow together. If you look at the LSTs versus the LRTs, a lot of the LST withdrawals, if you do a closer study on this, it's actually directly transferred over into LRT deposits. And it's after some mechanism change, some sort of regime change, where the trend reversed, right? Where Renzo put out their withdrawals mechanism, all the pent up demand from previous when they depegged probably started flowing in. It was like, hey, we want to get out of this. So it was this mechanism upgrade that triggered this pairwise direction reversal. And if you notice even more, right, like the a good portion of the stake that was lost via this LRT withdrawal is not actually directly captured by symbiotic, right? You can notice how the magnitude of the red line, it's like 300K, versus the magnitude of the growth of the blue line, right? It's only like 250-ish. So a lot of the stuff is actually like, where's the stake going, right? Like, how much is actually being captured by symbiotic? Understanding this is going to be pretty important in the end. So we find that like out of the roughly 440K ETH withdrawn out of EigenLayer in the past month, roughly like 92K ETH is withdrawn by users that also are depositing into Symbiotic. And these users deposit 96K ETH into Symbiotic. So there's a difference of like 4K there. Perhaps like some users that are depositing into Symbiotic are also, adding a little more additional into Symbiotic as well. But what's interesting here is that Symbiotic so far has like roughly 250 to 260K ETH staked within it. This is as of July 3, July 4. So 96 out of 250 is a pretty big number, right? It's like 35 to 40%, which means that a lot of the security in Symbiotic is like directly attributed towards people rebalancing out of EigenLayer. If you take the sort of, on the other hand, like if you take the other side, roughly 20% of the stake that leaves EigenLayer is going into Symbiotic, which sort of means in this case that roughly 20% of the withdrawals from EigenLayer are sort of being like recycled back into the restaking ecosystem. And the other 80%, where that goes, it's probably users trying to diversify into other sources of yield throughout DeFi. It's unclear where that actually goes. But the 20 to 80% difference is fairly noticeable. While it might not be like as important right now, given the fact that a lot of restaking functionality is not live yet, it's a good data point that we can build off of going in the future. If we do a further breakdown of the destination of this 96K ETH, we'll actually find that a lot of it is actually deposited directly into Symbiotic rather than Mellow. So this chart actually shows a lot of the how a lot of the Mellow vaults have grown, conditioned on the fact that the stake that's being deposited in these Mellow vaults are being withdrawn out of EigenLayer. It's actually like quite patternless in my opinion, unless you want to find some brand loyalty with Renzo via the orange line. Otherwise, probably some of the deposits into the Mellow vaults are mostly geared towards the vaults with higher TVL. But in general, like it seems pretty patternless. Yeah, it's unclear how this grows in the future, but it's pretty interesting to note that like, hey, a lot of the people that were in LRTs before are choosing to like, if there is the option to just go directly into Symbiotic right now, they will pick that over choosing a different LRT via Mellow. Yeah, as an aside, this is something that I looked at previously, but like the idea of pendle points, right? This was the big meta game throughout 2024. And it's pretty interesting to note that for the Mellow LRTs, their principal tokens trade at roughly 18% implied yields. And this is obviously higher than the EigenLayer LRTs, who trade at like 6 to 8%, I think. Yeah, 6 to 8%. Sorry, 6 to 8% implied yields for their PTs. Yeah, this makes sense, right? It's because there's no anticipation anymore with EigenLayer, right? They already announced their airdrop. There are pre-markets that have like somewhat of a notion of pricing on them already. Either Fi and Renzo have also released their airdrops as well. So on average, like probably it's a common theme, right? Users probably pay a premium for variance or anticipation in the end. But what's probably even more interesting that I'm not showing here is the fact that a lot of the EigenLayer LRTs back in February when they were first launched, they were trading at 25% implied yield. So there's a discount on this now, right? The discount of roughly like 6 to 7% with the Mellow LRTs. So yeah, what are some of the implications on the dependent services down the line? So to summarize, number one, from what we've seen previously, LRT performance and their stake stickiness sort of forms like a feedback loop, right? We've seen this with Renzo. We've seen how like the Renzo depeg back in April, end of April-ish, yeah. You can probably guess that a lot of that depeg, a lot of that sentiment probably transmits downwards into the increased withdrawal demand in June. This leads to the second point, which is that probably insufficient expectation of insufficient rewards causes stake and security migration. So where does the stake go? If it's recycled, then it probably flows to areas with the least resistance. In this case, we see that Mellow has grown stably while symbiotic caps were hit, while symbiotic couldn't grow anymore, right? So we'll go to these intermediary sources in the interim. In the end, these flows are also triggered by some sort of like mechanism change or regime change. As we've discussed previously, it was the Renzo withdrawal mechanism that caused a lot of these flows to happen. So from these user decisions, we can see that roughly 20% of the withdrawals are recaptured, recycled within the restaking ecosystem, while 80% actually leaves. Like I said before, this might be quite different when slashing and payments go live in the end. But in the end, this, I guess, ratio between what is staying in the ecosystem, what is staying in the restaking ecosystem versus what is actually leaving, maybe towards like, lending yields or whatever. This ratio is probably highly dependent on number one, the TVL, the magnitude of the TVL within EigenLayer, and number two, users' expectations for these rewards. Due to these like dynamic changes in general, it becomes quite important for AVSs to be able to, mitigate the effects of this stake churn on their economic security, right? If I'm an AVS and I know that stake is always flowing around between EigenLayer and Symbiotic, this naturally adds a different dimension for me to consider my security levels. So how do we like, mitigate some of this stuff in the end? Assuming infrastructural support for these AVSs, one potential method, it can make sense for a lot of these AVSs or services to support a multi-marketplace approach. We can consider a toy example here. Yeah, suppose we have three different services, A, B, and C. There are two marketplaces, 1 and 2. Services A and B are on marketplace 1, and service C is on marketplace 2. And we can suppose the profit for corruption on service B is 7, and the profit for corruption on service A is 3. So the orange operators, I don't know if you can see it, but like the row of X's, the second row of X's on the top left, they have a decision to make right now. They're anticipating that if they migrate over to Marketplace 2, the yield that they will capture from service C is greater than the yield that they will capture from the sum of A and B together. And after making this calculation, they decide to actually just migrate over to Marketplace 2. So in the first example, service B does not support a multi-marketplace approach. So when the orange operators do decide to leave, there's sort of a deficit in the security for service B now. If you recall, the profit for corruption for service B is 7, and now there's only 5 security left, which means that there is potential in the future for adversarial threats to come in and corrupt the service. On the other hand, if you consider example 2, service B does support a multi-marketplace approach. So when the orange operators do decide to migrate over to marketplace 2, they continue to help secure service B. In that sense, service B can sort of rely on the economic security from both marketplaces together, making it more robust in general. This is just a toy example, but it does provide some color on how this approach might actually reduce excess risk down the road. But ultimately, this notion of stake loss is quite complex. The threats from stake loss are, its biggest threat is basically it might cause like increased potential for stake losses down the road. What do I mean by this? If you consider the fact that say like initially a service loses stake in the beginning, this necessarily decreases the security profile for this AVS, which increases the likelihood that this service might be corrupt in the future, which causes future stake loss as well. So this is the restaking analogy for what we call the cascading liquidation risk that we see in lending markets as well. As a brief refresher on that, it's basically when, in super volatile times when the overall market is down 20%, fairly low liquid collateral is, you know, gets hit by the market, right? The users with the riskiest positions, if it's some whale with a super risky position, then um, super high loan to value positions, they get liquidated. That initial batch of collateral gets sold on the market, and the excess slippage from that causes causes the collateral price to further depreciate, right? Which impacts further users down the road with quote unquote safer LTVs. So you can imagine sort of a chain effect there where like one batch of liquidations causes the next batch, so on and so forth, right? It's the same analogy that we can see in restaking, right? One loss in security in one instance causes the service to be corrupted, which causes other things to be corrupted as well. In the end, one of the most important problems for us to figure out is basically, how can we create equilibria where, services learn how to provide these levels of incentives that make them robust to these adversarial threats that come from stake churn. Later today, Tarun will talk about something that him and Malesh have been working on that goes into this in much more depth. This is the abstract from the paper that is probably going to be released today. I don't know, today, tomorrow, sometime during EthCC, who knows. But yeah, hopefully this provides a good overview on how we're thinking about these problems in restaking, especially with the dynamism that's happening between stake as well. And I guess what this might imply in the future. So, yeah. Thanks everyone.